let's now have a little bit of a look at what that indigenous world was like at the time that Europeans started to interface with it at what we're calling the frontier. One of the things that's quite interesting as you're addressing this topic is just the overwhelming amount of evidence, when you're looking for it, of, I guess, a highly developed, non-nomadic indigenous culture. If you have a look at these images that I've presented for you, these are images that are either photographs taken at the turn of the century, showing the state of some settlements in Australia, such as this one over here. We've also got the weir systems, fish trap systems, aquaculture systems that are quite huge, if you can see all these dam walls and the size of the people near it. The huge waterworks features and so on, which are designed to build an aquaculture for Indigenous society, effectively farming and irrigation. The structures of villages all across Australia from the earliest times with chimneys built in and so on. It's clear that Indigenous society wasn't just this nomadic place, but we can go to the next level. There's this richness to Indigenous society in Australia that grows out of a huge number of different tribal lands, different clan lands, different territories of different groups. We've spoken often about the Turrbal and Yagara people in our part of the world here on the coast near Brisbane. But all over Australia, there's this patchwork of languages and cultures that are trading with each other, interacting with each other, had common understandings of laws. And this isn't a new discovery. These maps by people like Norman Tyndale, who are tracing Australia's Indigenous languages, they go back nearly a century. This very simple map that I grabbed here is from 1939, and it's a map of well-established trade routes. If you like, this is as if someone today were drawing maps of airline routes or of railway lines, of the carriage of goods from one region of Australia to another as a formal system of trade, of interaction, of commerce. So there's this huge body of research that continues right up until now that's seeking to understand the nature of this complex Aboriginal society. And I'd like to point out at this outset that Europeans were aware that this society was highly developed. Right from the outset, we find in Cook's journals experiences of interactions with Indigenous people that indicate a complexity to land ownership, a complexity to the way in which different people operate in different areas of Australia. There might have been some Europeans who are unaware of this complexity, but there's a huge amount of evidence that explorers and graziers were very much aware of what was on the other side of the frontier. So at this outset, let's pick up on some of the themes that are raised by Bruce Pascoe and backed up with evidence from primary sources in his book, Dark Emu. Firstly, he points out that the myth of the simplistic hunter-gatherer has been perpetuated out there deliberately. And that's despite a huge amount of evidence that disputes that imagery and this framing of Aboriginal life in the period of colonisation. In other words, the hunter-gatherer nomadic image isn't true. There are permanent settlements that did exist all across Australia, quite established ones, reported on, recorded by the early official explorers. Thomas Mitchell is an example of one of those, who comes up through Western New South Wales and into what's now Queensland. He's seeing what he describes as villages. Throughout Victoria, South Australia, Queensland, there are reports of farming. Maybe not in exactly the same model as European farming, but it's clear that agriculture did exist. There was a system of law tied to religious law established, known and enforced across the land. When we look at the Beveridge property and the disputes that they had with the Indigenous in the Murray River in 1843, you can see there is ritual punishment in place for attacking, or as it said in those primary sources, molesting women. The law was well known, it was well established, and it was well enforced. We can see this in the early days of settlement in 1788 in Sydney Harbour as well, when Europeans bristle up against existing laws. Indigenous Australians, Aboriginal Australians, might have been uncertain of the nuances of white law, of British law, but certainly it's pretty clear that the colonisers were aware that laws existed amongst their Indigenous neighbours. Trade routes, migration routes were well established. These routes were followed by graziers. The pathways through the bush were well trampled before sheep and cattle moved into those areas. Most of our early explorers, graziers, talk of following trails, and they're probably following trade routes, migration routes, right across our continent. So be wary of any of the source materials that you might run across that deny or ignore these kind of features. They may be carrying some perspectives, biases that are being deliberately overlooked. If European settlers are not mentioning these aspects, just think about why that might be. If they're talking about disputes over sheep, maybe there's other issues going on as well that are just not making into the written record. So you need to make judgments on the usefulness and the reliability of sources, evaluations. Get back to that ISMG. Think about where your strengths have been in the past. Think about what you need to drill down into when you're working on your ISI. In dealing with the ISI, think about sources in terms of these tools we've got. RAP, how reliable a source is. Are the voices in it representative of the mainstream view, or are they representative of all the people involved? Are they representative of only one group, such as white European settlers? How relevant are they to any inquiry questions developing? Are the ideas in them actually accurate? Are the views coming through correct? Is there some sort of falsity going on here? Are people covering up, lying? Do you think there is other evidence that calls into question what you're looking at? Authenticity gets at the idea of almost sincerity and reality as opposed to fakeness. And we live in a time where people talk about fake news. What perspectives come through? Think of the context, the actions of the people involved, the beliefs, attitudes, values at the times, the motives people might have for writing at that time and place in that context. Who's the voice you're hearing? What's its origin? Is it a newspaper? Is it a police report? And what purpose people might have for those. Work out your author, the date, the audience that's intended for it, the messages that are coming through. Is there some sort of agenda and purpose here again? What's the nature of this, and does that mean there are certain techniques that come through?